Outdated processes and systems waste valuable billable hours. LawPay's trusted industry-leading payment features get you paid 39% faster and 33% more. Maximize efficiency and profitability with payment features like automated billing, flexible payment options, and next-day payments. Do more of what you're meant to do with a partner committed to your greatness. Learn more by visiting lawpay.com/dcbar. Ready to move beyond task-based lawyering and focus on strategic success? Transform your legal practice with MyCase, the all-in-one solution that streamlines case management and financial operations. Empower your firm with comprehensive control over cases, clients, and cash flow, and drive success with a platform built on decades of legal expertise. See why 18,000 legal professionals trust MyCase to automate tedious and time-consuming tasks so they can focus on what matters most, delivering outstanding outcomes for their clients. Try MyCase free today at mycase.com/dcbar.
Welcome to Brief Encounters and to the 5th episode of the Securities Regulation and Enforcement series within the Brief Encounters podcast. My name is Valerie Mirko. I'm a partner at Armstrong, Teasdale, and I also chair the firm's Securities Regulation and Litigation practice. And with me is my co-host, William Nelson.
Thanks, Valerie. And I'm an Associate General Counsel at the Investment Advisor Association. And I am really excited. This is our 5th episode, so congrats to us. Congrats to our listeners, but also just really excited to introduce the guest we have today. And that's Cristina Martin Firvida. She was appointed as the Investor Advocate and Director of the Office of the Investor Advocate at the SEC back in January of 2023, so not that new anymore, but still relatively new. Prior to her appointment at the SEC, Cristina was the Vice President for Financial Security and Livable Communities at AARP, where actually I was privileged enough to know her in her previous position and get to work with her. And she was also previously AARP's Director of Financial Security and Consumer Affairs. So Cristina, thank you again so much for being on the podcast today. We're so happy to have you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting us today. And before I begin, I would like to remind your listeners that my remarks today are provided in my official capacity, but they do not necessarily reflect the views of the Commission, the commissioners, or other members of the SEC staff.
And Cristina, as you know from our discussions and as our listeners know from the last few episodes, the point of view of the podcast is really to look at current securities issues through the lens of Dodd-Frank. And now, of course, the existence of the Office of the Investor Advocate is rooted in Dodd-Frank, specifically Section 915. So it's nice that we have this tie-in today. I wanted to ask you first to tell us a little bit about the formation of the Office of the Investor Advocate, which took a couple years to stand up after Dodd-Frank because it was such a new concept.
That's right. So, of course, protecting investors has always been a core mission of the Securities and Exchange Commission. But, as the financial crisis that really began in 2007 demonstrated, there were still a lot of gaps that the entire infrastructure that protects both investors and consumers is designed to provide. So one of the things that the SEC was lacking was a dedicated voice inside the commission for investors, both retail and institutional investors, someone who could specifically think through emerging issues as well as proposed rulemakings exclusively from the perspective of the impact and benefit to investors. And this is what Dodd-Frank wanted the Office of the Investor Advocate to provide. As part of this idea of giving investors a dedicated voice inside the commission, Congress designated very specific functions that the Office of the Investor Advocate needs to perform. So one of those is to assist retail investors specifically with significant problems that they might have with the commission itself or with any of the self-regulatory organizations that the commission oversees. In addition, the statute that established the office also directed us to identify areas in which investors would benefit from regulatory changes, to identify problems with financial service providers and investment products, and to analyze the potential impact on investors of proposed rules and regulations. In addition to those functions, Dodd-Frank also provided the Office of the Investor Advocate with the authority to provide recommendations to both the Commission and to Congress, which is a very unique authority. And last, it required that the office do two things in order to meet these functions. It required that the Office of the Investor Advocate report twice every year to Congress with its activities and objectives. And it required that the office establish an ombuds in order to assist investors with problems they might have. There was no ombuds at the Securities and Exchange Commission until Dodd-Frank required it and directed the Office of the Investor Advocate to appoint one.
So, Cristina, I really appreciate the background, especially because when the Office of the Investor Advocate was being stood up, I was at NASA, where I was the general counsel for several years. And of course, you're the second investor advocate. And the first investor advocate was a NASA alum, Rick Fleming. And he had also been a state regulator for a long time before that. But this is all to say, I have watched closely what the Office of the Investor Advocate has done for, 10 plus years at this point. And your reports are actually incredibly helpful to me. They were incredibly helpful when I was at NASA. They've been incredibly helpful since I came back to private practice. And the reason for that is they're very thoughtful, first of all, and very in-depth, but also they're almost like an early notification system in terms of identifying issues that have a great impact on retail investors. And some of these issues may be new issues. Some of them may be issues that have changed over time. But I think that serves an incredibly important purpose for those of us in the defense bar for securities at this point, because it gives us a sense of where things might go. Which is all to say, I was hoping you could discuss some of the topics that the Office of the Investor Advocate has focused on in the past few years.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that I agree with you that when we are performing our functions, as designated under our statutory authority, if we're doing a good job, then we are flagging for both the Commission as well as for Congress issues that are vexing investors, whether retail investors or institutional investors, in the moment. And that flexibility that we have, because we're not a rulemaking division. We're not examining or enforcing. In a sense, we're a real-time reporter of life as it is experienced for an investor today. And so that gives us the freedom to say things, report things, repeat things. It's very important. One of the most important things that I think this office does today is listen to investors. We want to hear from them directly, and we want to repeat what we are hearing from them so that we are not introducing our own bias or our own preconceived notions as either securities lawyers or as advocates about what the right answer is to some of the problems that investors are facing. That the first thing that we need to do is report the problems, identify, as the statute requires us to do, identify problems either with the Commission itself or with products or services that investors are using. And so some of what we have been reporting in the more recent years includes, concerns with the growth in private markets, as well as, to be fair, we often hear from many investors the desire to be permitted to invest in private markets. So both sides of that. Have focused quite a bit on the concerns that arise, as well as the benefits that come from the growth in technology in investing and how that has allowed a new class of self-directed investors to engage in capital markets without working with a broker or an investment advisor. In both of these cases, I'm flagging there's a concern and there's also, a benefit. And making sure that we're relaying what we hear from investors about what they both struggle with and what they like, what they benefit from and what is problematic. That is an important part of the function of this office.
Great. And Christina, I think one of the questions I have, and I know others will be interested to hear, is, you've talked about some of the functions, but can you talk about practically how your office, engages with investors, but then kind of advocates for investors at the commission?
For sure. So one of the things, as you flagged, I'm the second investor advocate appointed to this position. Rick Fleming, who formerly was a state regulator, as the first investor advocate, he had to stand up a structure that would fulfill the functions that the statute required. And 10 years out, one of the important obligations that I have, and to go to your point about how do we do this practically, one of the important obligations I have is to look at the structures we have as they've matured. We're in our 10th year now. How do we think about future challenges investors will have? And how do we structure our office so that it can continue to meet those functions going forward in the future? So to do that, we have essentially concentrated our efforts into essentially 4 work streams. So the first is we have the Office of the Ombuds, and the Ombuds is there to meet that first function that I described, to assist retail investors with significant problems that they may have with the commission or with self-regulatory organizations. The second work stream is that we have an Office of Investor Research that allows us to identify problems that investors have, identify and test solutions that would address those problems, and to do that in a data-driven, evidence-based way. The third work stream that we have is we do investor engagement so that we also can hear directly from investors. As I said a few minutes ago, this is something that is very important to me in my tenure, that we be open to listening directly from investors, especially those who do not regularly already communicate with the commission or with other financial regulators. And so again, here, in order to engage with investors, we have to be intentional about reaching out to different investing communities. We have to be thoughtful about how we create an environment that fosters dialogue, and we need to be willing to commit to listen to all viewpoints. So this is a third work stream that we have, again, to satisfy the function of identifying both problems and potential solutions. And then the fourth work stream that we have cannot be too much of a surprise to your listeners. We have a group of attorneys who are dedicated to analyzing proposed rules and regulations and thinking through the potential impact on investors. And so that's a much more traditional model of how investor advocacy is done, which is to really think through the proposals that the commission puts out and comment on them and provide the commission with advice or observations about the impact that those proposals would have on investors, both, again, retail as well as institutional. So those are the 4 core work streams that we use to meet these specific directives that Congress provided to this office.
And Cristina, one of the work streams also has its own Dodd-Frank link because, of course, Dodd-Frank had several provisions on financial literacy, investor testing, and so forth. Those go beyond the mandate of the Office of the Investor Advocate, but they are very core to your work streams as well.
That's exactly right. So this office is not required to perform investor testing, but we are authorized to do it. And it was something that I really want to especially give credit to Rick Fleming, that he had the vision of establishing a group of economists whose specialty is investor testing. This is a group of economists that they're not going to be looking at the economic impact of a proposed rule. What they're going to look at is how will an investor react to a rule change in terms of their investing behavior. And we can do that by testing whether one kind of a disclosure is more effective at relaying information than another kind of a disclosure, for example, or getting a better understanding of how investors think about stock market performance. That's a kind of a research that we've recently published. All of these investor testing projects that we undertake are really designed to better understand how investors understand the information that they receive because of the disclosures that the commission requires, and then what they do with that information. Like, how does that behavior then change? How do decisions get made? And I really do think that Rick Fleming had seen the power of driving policymaking through data and evidence-based research. And it is something that I have also committed to continue to put an emphasis on.
Yeah, well, Cristina, I can, for one, say I've always been very impressed with all the work that comes out of your office. As Valerie said, your annual reports, I read them. I know a lot of other folks read them. Now, I know we've talked a lot about the office, the functions, but, I think one interesting question for you is, what goals do you have? You're the second investor advocate. So I'm just curious as kind of, maybe some of the goals you want to accomplish while you're in the role.
Definitely. Thank you for letting me talk about some of my own hopes for the time that I'm in this position. One that I've already touched on is I really do think it is extremely important to center our work on the actual experiences of investors. And while I have a deep commitment to continuing our research program and, in fact, expanding our research program, I appreciate why it is important to have rigorous research and the insights that we can offer the Commission and Congress on the basis of that research, how valuable that is. But I equally believe that hearing directly from investors, even though that's not, it's not going to be a scientifically valid sample size if you hear from 20 or 30 investors at an investor roundtable. That may be, but the importance of hearing directly from investors, to me, is something that we need to elevate, especially at a regulatory body like this one, which is so centered on legal analysis. Introducing the real life experiences of investors to the toolkit for policymakers, I think is really important. And I also have as a goal making sure that we're bringing diversity of viewpoints when we're talking to investors. The SEC is not unique in Washington in having groups of individuals that already have a lot of resources and opportunities that put them ahead of the game and that allow them to share their viewpoint, elevate their concerns through their comment letters, through their legal analysis, through their economic analysis. There's nothing wrong with any of that. Those are important voices to hear from. But the investors who do not have a law firm on retainer or don't normally file a comment letter, those viewpoints are also important to hear from. And so we've put a huge emphasis in this office, in my tenure, in the time that I've been here, on hearing from more investors who don't typically engage with the regulatory process already. And I'm very much hoping that that can be something that this office will continue to do long after I'm gone. The last thing I would say where that is concerned, I know that frequently the problems of retail investors can feel very sui generis and are often regarded as a little bit less structured and a little bit more, each unhappy investor has his own unique set of circumstances. And it can make it difficult to really think about wholesale policy changes that would make a difference in the lives of individual retail investors. That is something that has often been flagged for me. Retail investors are individually very unique. I think that's true, but I think that only makes their experiences that much more complex and rich. And so in the time I've been in the Office of the Investor Advocate, I have put a real emphasis on thinking about the problems that retail investors face and acknowledging that institutional investors also have many challenges, but they're also better equipped to analyze and represent those problems to the commission, and that in some ways their problems are more alike. So we have put a big emphasis on, for example, thinking about how we can improve the services we provide through the ombuds group, thinking about how we can make the, so to speak, the customer experience of someone who has a complaint and brings it to the ombuds, how we can make that a better experience for the retail investor. Really putting a focus on the more difficult challenges that retail investors have and thinking about how can we spot the patterns in the truly often unalike experiences that retail investors can report to this office.
Yeah, and I think those are all great points, Cristina. And I really do agree with you that I do think that diversity of viewpoints can really just only strengthen rulemaking when you get those diverse viewpoints. So I think that's a terrific point.
No, I also agree, especially because I'm thinking back to, retail investors are a little bit of a monolith, right? It's always retail investor protection, but it doesn't always acknowledge the nuances between the individual investor experience, which I think your office can add to the dialogue.
That's certainly our hope, that both through our research, but also through our direct engagement, we can really uncover for the commission and for others the really wide variety of experiences and goals and challenges that retail investors have. One example of this point that you're making, often it's missed, how differently retail investors can experience the same set of policies or the same investing opportunities. We have, in our most recent congressional report, noted that we have been spending a great deal of time thinking about the definition of accredited investor. We've been thinking about it for a variety of reasons. One being, the SEC has recently issued its periodic report on essentially the status of accredited investors. We hear from many investors about the definition of accredited investor. We know that other advisory committees to the commission have been thinking about and have been studying the definition of accredited investor. What we hear from investors is not one thing. What we hear is many things. We hear many investors coming to us, typically somewhat younger investors, meaning to say someone with a much longer investment horizon, telling us that, their early career, they perhaps do not have the income or the assets to qualify as accredited investors right now, but they have an investment horizon that makes them comfortable taking on the risk that some of these investments imply and can handle the illiquidity of those investments because they have a very, very long investment horizon. But they're locked out because they're young enough in their careers that they have not yet established the assets or the income to qualify. At the same time, we hear from many other investors that they're being pitched investments that they don't think are appropriate for them in retirement. So these would be older investors, or we hear from individuals who represent those investors or family members who see, retirees and their family being pitched illiquid investments. On the other hand, those investors, they do qualify because they're at the tail end of their careers or they're already retired. And so they have the assets that make it possible to be accredited investors. And so then the question becomes, well, one group is seeking greater protection, so to speak, being shielded from those investment opportunities. They don't want to get drawn into those kinds of investments. Another group very much would like to have that opportunity. And that's a paradox, right? Those are at cross purposes. You cannot satisfy both of those groups of investors by one policy choice. So the reason I lay that out in the detail I do is, if you said, well, I engage with investors, I listen to a group of advocates who represent retirees. So I did my job. I've listened, I've identified, I've analyzed, I've moved on. I'm going to make a recommendation about what's a good idea. If you don't thoughtfully and intentionally listen to a broader group of investor voices, you would miss out that there's another group that has a very, very different viewpoint. And so that's something that I think our office is doing a service when we are identifying as broad a variety of perspectives and elevating those perspectives. And then we can go to the next step of analyzing what would a proposal mean for each of those different retail experiences.
Cristina, our time together is coming to an end. So I was wondering if there was anything else you wanted to highlight before William wrapped us up.
I really do want to thank you for letting us have time this afternoon together. I know we've talked a lot about engagement and research, which are two of the most important tools that we have in the Office of the Investor Advocate for identifying and understanding the specific challenges that investors have, especially retail investors. One of the things that I would just want to do before we go today is, I really encourage anyone who is interested in these particular topics to look at the reports that we have published on our webpage, which you can see at sec.gov/advocate. And in particular, I would really encourage everyone to especially take a look at our congressional reports and our research reports. There's a lot of, I would say, counterintuitive findings that our research has uncovered. And again, here, I just want to say that it is one of the biggest commitments that this office has to asking questions, asking investors directly, asking questions through our research, not being afraid of discovering that questions may not get the answers you anticipate. Counterintuitive results are okay. And, surprising data is welcome, because when we find those counterintuitive results or that surprising data, that's when we really especially know that we're doing a good job. We're bringing new information to the commission and to the broader advocacy community to think about, to reflect upon, and hopefully to get to better policy outcomes for investors.
Well, I will definitely second that, Cristina. I really encourage all of our listeners to go to the SEC website, review those reports. They're wonderful resources. But again, I just want to thank you again so much, Cristina, for coming onto the podcast today, talking about the office, talking about your goals for the future. Valerie, as always, it's been a pleasure, and I really look forward to the next time.
Yes, thank you to both of you. Cristina, thank you again for being our guest, and to our listeners, till next time.
This episode of Brief Encounters was brought to you in part by our sponsors, LawPay and MyCase. To learn more about how these solutions can work for you, check out the description of this episode.